All right, I want to thank everybody for joining us for today's session entitled Journey into the Clouds, Cloud First Digital Transformation. Our guest speaker for today is Ed Peliquin with Asterisk, and I'll introduce him in just a moment. You can go to the next slide, Ed. But before we do, just want to do a couple of quick things. If you're relatively new to some of the Asterisk's webinar and webcast series that we've been running. Let me just take a minute and tell you a little bit about who Asterisk is, and then we'll go into kind of why we're doing this, and then we'll introduce our speaker and get into it. So in terms of who we are as a company, we successfully deliver highly specialized services, processes, technology, outsourced services, meant to fundamentally transform how science-based businesses operate. We do this in an effort to improve scientific outcomes in the lives of people everywhere. As a company, we were established way back in 1995. We're privately held, and we originated as the IT division of APBI, which was a life science research organization. We operate from 7 offices in the United States and 1 in beautiful Costa Rica, and we are headquartered in Red Bank, New Jersey. In terms of the companies that we help, we're dealing with mostly with Fortune 1000 life science enterprises. We deal with chemical companies and CPG companies, government research institutions. Generally speaking, anybody with large and fast-growing IT outsourced or compliance needs is going to fit well within the scope of services that Asterisk delivers to our customers. And we can go to the next slide and I'll describe some of those services in a little more detail to you. So we say that our services span the complete life cycle of what we call the scientific data system needs. And what that means is we can come into an organization and through business process analysis and enterprise architecture, help you determine what technology you need to function, what technology you need to achieve your business goals. That's everything from architecting out what your cloud migration strategy might be. From there, we can get into laboratory and quality management system selection services, picking the right tools based on the outcomes of the business process analysis. And we can actively participate or take over development and implementation of those software applications. We can do the computer system validation of those systems once we're done, and then we can provide ongoing on-demand services for those systems, training, upgrades, etc. And then finally, if you require it, we have staffing available. Whether that staffing is technical staffing or whether that's scientific staffing, we can help staff your organization from those 2 perspectives. We can go to the next slide. So that's a little bit about Asterisk. Now, let me take a moment to introduce our speaker today, Ed Peliquin. He's a delivery manager for laboratory informatics services here at Asterisk, and he brings a wealth of experience, 17 years in total, implementing informatics solutions, mostly in global life science companies, contract labs, and manufacturing industries. A great track record of driving success and delivering value to client projects, very valued member of the team here. And Ed, I'll let you kind of pick it up, and then I'll swing back on at the end, and I'm going to sit back and enjoy listening to your presentation.
All right, thanks, Kevin. Appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for taking the time out of your day to come join us. Like Kevin said, I'm Ed Peliquin, delivery manager here at Asterisk. So my main role here is LIMS implementations, but I have had experience in other areas, and I can tell you this topic is, it's one of the newer, more exciting topics that I've been dealing with personally on my projects as of late. A lot of companies that I work with, a lot of our customers are trying to do, some portion of this, moving parts of their systems into the cloud and dealing with the challenges that arise because of that. So what are we going to talk about today? So a couple of things. We want to understand the reasons for transitioning to the cloud. So with that, why are companies looking at doing this? What's the big deal? I personally didn't know a lot about this until just a few years ago when I, really started to have to deal with this on projects. We're going to discuss some of the common areas of concern when migrating to the cloud, so primarily focused on security, integration, and then the big one, compliance. That's a really big deal for those of you who are in regulated industries. And we're going to review some best practices for migrating to the cloud. So with that being said, so what we're looking at here is a breakdown of different cloud offerings. So the key takeaway here is in these 4 verticals, you can see that there are varying levels of provider managed versus customer managed cloud offerings. So traditionally, customers fell into the far left vertical, which is everything is sort of handled on site. We have our own IT department. These are, all of these different factors are managed by, by you. Then one step above that, you can start to outsource or virtualize or put into the cloud, however you want to call it, the infrastructure. So that's virtualization, your servers, storage, networking. So a lot of companies are in this phase. So they're starting to put their systems in data centers that they don't actually manage, and sort of outsourcing just the infrastructure related pieces. Then the next level up is the platform. So everything is managed by another provider, with the exception of the actual applications itself. So the applications are still managed by you, but security, databases, operating systems, all of these things are going to be handled by the provider. And then finally, which I think more accurately could be referred to as SaaS, or software as a service, it's an acronym. Everything is managed by the provider. So this is things like, if you're familiar with Viva, Viva Vault. So if you have implementation of that, they manage that for you. Basically, you access it via a browser, log in. You can do whatever configuration they allow you to do through their software, but everything about that software is managed by the provider. Okay, so getting back to architecture in general, what you're looking at here is a diagram that shows you a traditional setup for an informatics architecture for a company. Now, this isn't for one specific LIMS in particular. So don't read too much into this. Your mileage may vary with what you have, but everything here being on site, you'll have your LIMS database server, your application server. Maybe you're using a Citrix to virtualize it, or maybe your LIMS is already web-based, like LabVantage or StarLIMS. And then you'll have varying degrees of direct connections to the supporting system. So you'll have your document management system. Maybe you have a QMS or an ELN. Some LIMS have that built in. A CRM, ERP, reporting. So you'll have a combination of direct interfaces with your on-premise LIMS to these systems, but then also a direct connection from a web browser or a desktop client directly to these systems. The key takeaway here is that everything is managed and hosted on-premise. So all security, IT staffing, application support, like your system administrators, all of that is handled by you. But what a lot of companies are doing now, and where they're finding a lot of challenge and a lot of resistance, is going from something that looks like this to something that looks like this. Where now I've circled, just for example here, I've circled a section of these applications to simulate that these are now in the cloud, or what we're referring to as the cloud. So this may be hosted by a provider like Viva, like a SaaS offering, or it could be something that you're just hosting yourself, but it may be a data center that isn't locally on your at your facility. So you can take this cloud and sort of vision it being any combination of these systems. So you could even have your LIMS in the cloud and everything else on premise. But this is the main challenge. And one thing to note here is, you can't just take a forklift and move your entire solution to the cloud. And I'm not really focusing on everything being in the cloud, because I realize that for the majority of companies out there, that's not possible. Unless you're a very small organization with very minimal need for an on-premise system, moving completely to the cloud is probably out of the question. You're probably going to end up in a situation that looks similar to this, or some what we call a hybrid model. So you'll have some things in the cloud, some things on site. A good example of that, let's say you're a manufacturing company and you have instrumentation that controls your machinery. You have systems in place to monitor that process. Some of these things can't be moved to the cloud. They have to be on site. But some applications like your QMS system, CRM, reporting, all of these things, they may be a candidate for moving to the cloud. So this is where I see most companies going. And there's a lot of challenges, but there's also a lot of benefits to doing this. And we're gonna talk about that next. All right, so let's talk about some of these benefits. So why are people wanting to move to the cloud, right? Like, what's the big deal? Why can't I just have everything on site? Well, disaster recovery. So I'm going to just kind of go through these, and explain them. So disaster recovery, what that means is when you have a system that is hosted by a provider, let's say you're using Amazon Web Services, let's say you're using Microsoft Azure, or any of the other SaaS offerings, they usually handle the disaster recovery, and they do a pretty good job of that. They have redundancies built in. They have data centers all around the world so that they can serve up their offerings with better performance to closer to where the customers actually need that access. So having that expert disaster recovery, as opposed to you sort of having your IT department manage all that, can be a much better situation. I used to work in an IT department, and I can tell you that our disaster recovery, although we had a good system in place, we didn't have nearly the amount of resources that a lot of these cloud-based vendors have to offer backup plans, basically. Easy access, this is huge. So a lot of customers that I deal with, one thing they struggle with, especially with LIMS, because LIMS is really my area of expertise, is the access. So some LIMS systems are not web-based. They're not natively web-based anyway. And so accessing them is always a challenge. They always need to have some virtualization element to access them. And in this case, when things are moved into the cloud and, once they're set up and they're tested and verified that they're working properly, allows it much easier access to your user base to access that software. So, for example, if you have a cloud-hosted LIMS, the access to it is going to be web-based. So anybody with a device that's has the minimum requirements of using that application over the web can access it now. So that's one of the main benefits here. Reduced cost is another one. Actually, I think this should probably be number one. I think a lot of companies view the cloud as like this giant cost savings because they think they're gonna, we're gonna eliminate all this excess IT overhead, high fixed costs of hardware, so we don't have to maintain servers locally anymore. But I'll say this, it's not always the case. This is not always a cost reduction, and your mileage may vary. So what I mean by that, let's say you have, getting back to my manufacturing analogy, let's say you have a manufacturing site where you physically cannot put certain applications on the cloud. Now, in that case, you still need the IT, you still need the hardware. So for you, if you move certain applications that you're able to into the cloud, maybe you eliminate some servers, maybe you eliminate a couple of, local IT, dedicated support, but you may not actually end up saving money based on, because there's going to be costs associated with it being in the cloud. You're going to have to pay the provider. You're going to have to pay licensing fees. So you really have to take a good look at your scenario or your situation and figure out if this actually does give you a cost reduction. Global availability, very similar to easy access, but when things are hosted in the cloud, and I'm really using Amazon as an example here because that's what's fresh on my mind from recent projects, is they have a really good ability to allow global availability for your system. Like they can make a copy of that available in another region and have them synchronized with each other really well. So when we talk about easy access, point number 2, global availability really goes hand in hand in that. Now, anybody with a web browser can access, whatever the software happens to be that you've put into the cloud. And if you're using one of these larger providers, they're able to replicate that so that it's available at much better performance locally around the globe. Okay, so here's just a few more. Scalable services, this is a big one. So what this means is when you decide to move to a cloud architecture, sometimes, especially if you're using like a SaaS vendor, you can just pay for what you need. So let's contrast that with an on-prem installation. So traditionally, when you buy a piece of software, you'd pay for some perpetual licensing, or maybe it's a recurring maintenance fee. you have some fee associated with that software when you have it locally. A lot of times, though, with a SaaS implementation, that cost model is a little bit different. A lot of it's pay for what you need. So that may or may not save you money. Again, this is very situationally dependent on what what system you're talking about and what your use case is. But it does allow you to scale much easier. So maybe they charge by the user, and you can do that real time. So I know this for a fact. We actually have a digital intercom system. So this is a really good example of scalability. My wife owns a childcare center. And in this childcare center, we have physical intercoms that I installed myself. It's like, all hardwired in the whole building. Now, we just added 4 more classrooms. Now, I have to go physically install these intercoms, and we can't because there's reasons why I cannot get wires from one building to the other. Long story short, we looked at a cloud-based intercom solution. And the way that you pay for that is you pay by the user. So each of our classrooms is now a user. We only pay for what we need. If we close a classroom down, we log on, we disable that classroom, our bill goes down. So that's where the scalability, that's really what I'm talking about. You only pay for what you need. Highly configurable. This one's a little bit, it's a little bit of a gray area because traditionally with an on-premise system, you can configure it. I don't know if this is necessarily a main benefit of going to the cloud, but it does make it, I will say, it does make it easier for folks to configure that software from remote places. Like they have access from all over the place. So configuration and the last point here, collaboration, I would argue are much better in a cloud-based platform than having them VPN in. If any of you are aware, if you ever try to VPN into your company's network to use a piece of software that's hosted locally and their VPN connection is very, very slow, how painful that is. Moving to the cloud on a good cloud provider, this can eliminate the majority of that pain. Okay. So, challenges. We're going to move on here. We're going to talk about the main challenges that we see when companies go from a traditionally on-premise system to a hybrid cloud solution. And I want to just draw your attention. There are a couple of white papers that were attached to this presentation that you can download and read on, whenever you have the time to do so. So I think you can access them through the links that are in the control panel of the webinar. I think I saw them there earlier. So we're going to focus on today. Now this is not an exhaustive list, obviously. We could talk about challenges of transitioning to the cloud for hours. Actually, each one of these blocks could be its own presentation. So we're going to stay at pretty high level, but give you hopefully some pretty good information about each category. So we're going to talk about security, integration, and finally, regulatory compliance. Okay, so first let's talk about security. So first thing, unsecured network. So when you host an application, where you subscribe to a software as a service application, that is a publicly accessible system, which means their network is constantly being bombarded from the world, from the outside web with attacks. And so your access risks can be mitigated by forcing multi-factor authentication. Use a vendor that can whitelist connections by IP addresses. So the point here is, if you decide to use a SaaS solution, you want to make sure that you've done your due diligence with the provider, that they have the necessary systems in place to block unwarranted access to your data. And I think for the most part, folks on this call, the software that you'd be using, this has probably been handled. There's some pretty big box vendors out there that most people are using. Access control. So enterprise solutions, they manage access to data via user roles and groups. And then these cloud-based solutions must provide the same control. And synchronizing with your corporate access control systems is required. So this is a big one. A lot of times when you're transitioning from an on-premise solution or architecture, you'll have like an LDAP, or you'll have some sort of Windows account for everybody. And a lot of times single sign-on is a requirement, but not every cloud vendor can support that, although I think that list is pretty small at this point. You want to make sure that your access control is seamless. You want to make sure that you can control the the user authentication and authorization, not only for your local applications, but for those for those applications that maybe used to be on site that are now not on site. They're in the cloud. All right, so data breach. Unauthorized data access by third parties is a possibility, right? Because they're publicly available. So I can just, open up my web browser and try to access any of these publicly available software systems. So on SaaS applications, though, the safety of the data is solely on the vendor. So yeah, you have a username and password, and that is your responsibility to not just make your password 1, 2, 3, 4. But a lot of the actual security for the servers, for the databases, for all the other pieces of that puzzle, generally the vendor is responsible for that. So it's important to understand the vendor's contractual obligations on the following things. So presence and scope of vendor security teams, like do they have dedicated security teams and audits to make sure that they're keeping up with the ever-changing security threats that are present on the internet. Policies around data breaches. So in the event that they do have a data breach, what's their policy around that? Are you going to be are they going to be held financially liable, or whatever the case may be? In your situation may vary, but you want to make sure you understand what systems are in place in the event of a data breach. What's your backup plan? Because obviously, like I mentioned earlier, one of the benefits of moving to the cloud is not having to handle all of that disaster recovery yourself, but allowing a larger provider with probably much larger resources for that to handle it. But what's their policy? What are their backups? How long does it take them to restore the data in the event of an issue? These are all things that need to be considered. And then understand your exposition to regulatory enforcement. So, what are you going to be responsible for in the event of a breach if for some reason you're regulated, and like if you have a HIPAA violation or something and it's a result of a data breach? So all these things sort of need to be hashed out with the provider before you go all in. And I'm not saying this to be negative or to dissuade you from moving to the cloud, but more just to start you thinking about the various challenges that are going to come up, especially for those of you who are in a regulated industry. Although I will say a lot of the companies that I'm working with now have had very good luck moving a lot of their systems into the cloud, especially hosting things in private clouds. So things like their LIMS database or their QMS system, their document management, they're all in the cloud now. Very little on site. Geographical data location. So one of the challenges that SaaS companies have, or anybody that hosts a piece of software in a specific geographical location, a lot of times they are subject to the rules and regulations of the country where that data resides. And this is an interesting one. So, for example, let's say you have a piece of software that you want to subscribe to in the cloud or move to the cloud, and that happens to be in another country, like, I don't know, let's say it's in China for some reason. Having that there, now that data sits there, there are local laws and regulations around that data. So one interesting thing to note here is if that is a case, if that is an issue, it may impact performance. So this is more of just a side note. If the data has to reside in that country because the company that's using that software is from that country, but their users may be in another country, you could end up with a performance issue there as well. So just something to consider. Although I don't know if this is actually like that common. I think most people who would run into this issue, the software would be hosted probably in the same company or the same country as they reside in. Okay, a couple more. So compliance requirements. The vendor is subject to different regulatory compliance and auditing depending on the industry country they serve. So a lot of these, a point to make here is a lot of these companies, they serve multiple industries. So you need to confirm that the vendor can comply with the regulatory requirements that you are responsible for, that apply to your industry. A lot of times, they'll seek out certifications just to sort of be able to sell their products to more markets or more industries. So you need to make sure that the vendor is audited by an external security team. It's a good thing that they're not self-audited, right? You want to make sure that vendor that you're thinking about moving to is independently audited. And then insider threats. So this isn't necessarily a cloud-specific security concern, because you can always have a bad actor, even if you're hosting your stuff on premise, right? You can have an employee that just is disgruntled and they give out the company's secrets. But it's the same issue with a cloud-based, right? Those cloud-based companies, they have their own employees. They have people there that, could potentially gain access to your data and, do malicious things to it. So, something to think about, but you want to also make sure that with whatever vendor you're working with, that they have policies and procedures in place to prevent this. Now, obviously, it's almost impossible to prevent this in every scenario, but it is something to consider. All right, and then misconfiguration. So this is kind of low on the totem pole here, but sometimes when you're responsible for the application yourself, like let's say you're only using the cloud to host an application that used to be on site, but it's not a SaaS solution. Even though this example says SaaS specifically, it doesn't have to be. You could host your own software in the cloud and misconfigure it and open yourself up to unauthorized access. So this is not really a cloud specific thing, but it is something to consider now that you're moving it onto potentially a completely different network from your own. You'll need to make sure that software is configured properly to make sure that it's as robust as you can make it. Okay, so integration. So this is an area that is a little more in my area of expertise, because I do more technical work, especially with LIMS implementations. I've had a number of customers that have LIMS systems that are on premise that want to talk to systems that are in the cloud, like the document management system, or vice versa. We have LIMS in the cloud and we've got instruments on site. So I know this is a challenge, and it will be a challenge. It's definitely something that needs to be analyzed beforehand to make sure moving to the cloud is going to be a right fit for you. So when you move from an on-premise installation to a cloud-based one, you're inherently going to decrease access to the cloud-based data stores. When you put something in the cloud, unless it's your own software that you own, especially if it's a SaaS, you're not going to have direct access, or you may have little access to the database directly, compared to when it's on site. Because when it's on site, you have direct access to everything because you own the servers and you own basically all the keys to the kingdom. So that's kind of point number 2 as well. And let's see. Yeah, cloud systems generally require data access through an API as well. So SaaS systems specifically, you cannot talk directly to their database, because a lot of times they're multi-tenant, which means that there's other customers' data in that database. So they're not going to give you, direct read-only access to the database. You're going to have to talk directly through an API. Which offers comparably less access. So you're going to be beholden to whatever access they give you. And reduce report development capabilities compared to on-premise. And that really just ties into the direct access with the database itself. So since you can't query it directly, a lot of times reporting is a little more challenging when you're dealing with a cloud-based solution. All right. Sometimes they offer no custom report development. Reduce capability for scripting. So a lot of systems, especially LIMS systems, will require some level of scripting or coding to build out that functionality. Should you subscribe to a SaaS solution or some other type of cloud-based software, maybe not specifically a LIMS, your ability to actually get in there and customize it and change, actually program in it is going to be probably limited to the tools that they give you through the front end. So you may be limited. But on a, most people who are moving to a cloud-based software are looking to use best practice workflows, and a lot of them are focused on best practice workflows. So your need to customize them, I find, is a little bit less than when you install something, out of the box on premise, and it basically does nothing out of the box. So a lot of these cloud-based ones are sort of built already with a lot of best practices built in, and then your need to tailor them is a little bit reduced. Let's see. Yeah, so scripting when it is allowed, yeah, your debug feedback may be limited, or you might just get a log file, which is not accessible by non-admins. All right, so here's a specific example. So I wanted to highlight just one challenge specifically that we've dealt with when a customer, this specific customer, a large pharmaceutical company, they had moved their entire LIMS system into the cloud. But they did do environmental monitoring. So they had, it says here 50 air samplers. So they had a lot of air samplers, and they were in several continents. But the LIMS itself was a global LIMS, but it was hosted in the cloud. The LIMS could not talk directly to those air samplers anymore. There was an issue with the firewall of the cloud-based provider that prevented them from talking directly to the local area IP addresses of these air samplers. So the solution to this problem was they had to use middleware. And this is something that may happen for one of you if this is a scenario that applies to you. The middleware was called Kepware, and what Kepware would do is it would read the information from these local air samplers, and then afterward it would transmit that information to a staging table in the LIMS database. So the Kepware could send the information for these instruments to the LIMS. The LIMS could then read them from the staging table and update its results. But the main challenge here was it used to be the case that the LIMS could talk directly to these air samplers and read that information. But when they moved it to the cloud, that connection no longer worked. And they had to implement this middleware solution to get those local raw data values into the cloud where the LIMS could then see those results. Okay, so last thing I want to talk about, or last concern, is the regulatory compliance concern. And I know this is a giant topic, all right? I realize that this could potentially go on for an entire presentation in itself. So I apologize in advance for it being a little brief, but just to give you hopefully enough of an overview to realize what you're dealing with here. So depending on the industry you're in, you may have to deal with a number of these regulations like GDPR, HIPAA, 21 CFR Part 11. Is your data going to be secure if you move it to the cloud? This is probably one of the main questions that we get asked quite a bit. And the answer to that is, well, it depends. But in a lot of cases, it is. It is actually as or more secure than what you have on your local setup, depending on the provider you go with. Like I said, because they have specialists that deal with this specifically, and they've designed their architecture to handle a number of these regulatory concerns. So disaster recovery, business continuity, due diligence, compliance, and documentation. So achieving a status of regulatory compliance, it requires having discipline and a process that ensures that the company is following the laws enforced by governing bodies in their geography. Or you have to voluntarily adopt the rules to meet industry standards. When we talk about moving to a cloud solution, the most common concern is how to achieve that. Like, how do you keep up with compliance now that the business is no longer in full control of that solution? So in life sciences specifically, common regulations, GDPR, HIPAA, and Part 11, those are sort of now handled jointly between between you as the customer and the provider, because there isn't necessarily a certification for every one of these different compliance concerns. So the cloud provider can secure the data, like they can encrypt it, they can put all sorts of controls in place to make sure it's secure, but they don't necessarily provide, certifications for every one of these. It's going to be sort of a case-by-case basis and depending on the software. So you're going to have to work with that provider to make sure that the way that that system is used, so validation is a big thing here. We want to make sure that whatever the use case is with that cloud software has been validated and tested to ensure that it meets these regulatory requirements before you go all in on that. So some companies that I've worked with actually have cloud software, that isn't validated. So it's not used for GXP data. It's used for just, some ad hoc reporting or whatever. So not every system that gets put into the cloud may have to deal with this. But if you put something like your LIMS in the cloud or even your document management system, there's going to have to be some thought given to its compliance status. Like I said, cloud providers typically pursue certifications that enable them to sell their services smoothly. The problem is that there are no certifications for the regulations above for a commercial cloud provider. Instead, they can offer services to help make sure that it meets these, but there isn't a certification for it. As a result, most companies review the cloud public offering for security, and they tend to escalate to virtual private clouds for increased security. So what that means is a lot of times these larger software vendors, they can host it for you in a public, SaaS environment, which is multi-tenant, or they allow a private option, which is still hosted, but your data is the only data in there and can provide it with a higher level of security. So not every company offers this, but if they do, it's a lot. I see a lot of companies use that because it gives them a higher degree of security over their own data, even though it's hosted. It's not being shared with anyone else on the same systems. Also, important to review any SLAs that the SaaS provider can provide you, and you want to do periodic checks of their own policies too, to make sure they don't have a change in their policy, which would then put you out of compliance because of something that's out of your control. So a lot of these things are factors to consider when we're talking about regulatory compliance. Okay, so next we want to talk about the best practices for planning your cloud transition. All right, and this is sort of, getting back to my original slide where I said you can't just, pick it up and put it in the cloud. There has to be a process in place to do this. It's not as simple as flipping a switch. You can't boil the ocean, so to speak. You want to take a piece at a time, analyze it. So you want to do a full business process analysis. You want to look at the current state, and are there any opportunities for improvement, right? Like I said before, you may not be able to move specific things into the cloud. So that's where this analysis comes into play. You want to leverage your industry experts, look at what they're doing in adjacent industries, and then name maybe some internal champions to sort of take a look at your specific business and figure out, does it make sense? After you figure out that business case or find out if it's going to make sense for you, you want to put together a to-be roadmap. So you want to make a plan. Say, we're going to start with this. This is going to be our timeline. We're going to, move this after this. So you want to put together that roadmap to figure out what is going to move when and how. Put all that stuff together. Move on to your selection. So you want to then, once you figure out what can be moved into the cloud, you want to start that selection process. So you want to go through, you want to talk to vendors. You want to figure out, can they help you meet compliance? What are their feature set? So one word of advice here, don't just pick a software because it has a great feature, right? There's so many other factors that go into that software. It could be performance, it could be its location, it could be their policies. All these things need to be worked out during the selection process. And then finally, move on to implementation. So as you can see here, it's a pretty long journey to go from an on-premise to a hybrid cloud solution. You have to really think about it in detail, plan step by step, and then you want to have an effective program management to facilitate the solution architecting, the system integration, cloud and data migration, which is something we really didn't talk about much earlier, but data migration is always a big challenge. You could be moving from some old software that's installed locally on users' PCs to a fancy new SaaS offering, and then you have to get all that data, if required, up into that new system. So that's almost a project in itself. And then for most of you, it probably has to be validated as well. All right, so here's just a quick risk matrix just to kind of compare and contrast the challenges of the concerns that we spoke about when you have them on-premise, your own site, versus having them in the cloud or in a hybrid solution. So for security, like I said, everything you are responsible for. So the business is fully responsible for managing and maintaining all the security, but it is a closed environment. When you move into that hybrid situation, that security responsibility is shared with the provider. SaaS is listed here, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a SaaS provider. It could also be, just a data center provider. But it is more complex because there's going to be multiple firewalls now. Everything's going to be distributed. So hybrid security is a little more challenging. Regulatory compliance. So on-premise, all regulatory compliance measures are the responsibility of the business, same as the security. But the systems are changed upon the explicit direction of the business. That's a big one. That's a big point to make, because when you have a cloud-based software, you are sometimes beholden to their update schedule. You have to take the updates as they deploy them. So you're still ultimately responsible for compliance, but it requires additional collaboration with the vendor to maintain that qualified environment, because they're going to be making changes whether you want to or not, in some cases, not all cases. So you have to constantly be aware of that. Integration, on-premise, typically easier. Why? Because everything's there. So those instruments that I mentioned earlier, which are connected to the local network, you can see them, you can talk to them. Now, once you move to a hybrid architecture, that can be more difficult, or in worst case, not even possible for systems to talk to each other due to not having, a full control from one system to the next over the internet, crossing multiple firewalls. All right. So again, here to review. This is what the journey should look like, or in our opinion, this is the best practice of what that transformation moving from on-premise to a hybrid cloud solution should look like. Business process analysis first. Have to do that. That's a big one. You have to do a full analysis of what your needs are, what software do you use, what regulations do you need to follow. You need to figure out what the candidates are to move to the cloud, if you can even do it. Next, you want to put together that roadmap, like I mentioned earlier. So now you've identified your things, you put together your plan, you map it all out. Then you evaluate, do your selection, talk to vendors, figure out what works, what doesn't work. Then quality and compliance. Now, I would say that quality and compliance and quality is probably thought about in every one of these phases, but just having a specific check for that can make that concrete. And then finally, a long way down the street here, you finally do the implementation, data migration, and then maybe managed services. All right, and that's it. So, Kevin, I guess it's back to you.
Great, Ed. Thank you so much. Awesome presentation, real clear. I'm sure everybody enjoyed the content. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.